Bonjour à toutes, bonjour à tous, chers amis.
Good morning, everyone, dear friends and colleagues, participants, operators, guests. Thank you for having responded to the summons from the Policy Center for the New South and the Center for Mediterranean Integration. This webinar and seminar co-organized by two of our partners who have reflected and worked and proposed suggestions for decision makers on the management of public politics, among them migration policy, intervene in a context where the migrants question is acquiring a new protagonism with regard to the management of the flows between both shores. And this happens within a context that is affected by decisions that have to do with us, that have to do with the mindset and the modes of cooperation in the Mediterranean. So the idea is to find responses to governance in connection with migration, irregular migration, and we are confronted today with the obligation of reflecting upon on the debates that we need to take a look, we need to take our backs on debates that belong to the past in the context of migrations involving young people and not so young people. So the goal is to consider that we need to have a rights-oriented approach rather than a transactional approach. So the European colleagues need to grant this the proper dimension, and we, as part of an analysis center, we need to involve ourselves in this reflection on the actions connected with migration-related issues, a topic which is quite recurrent in the politics having to do with neighboring countries. We are sure that our shared efforts are going to be given to the are going to give decision makers elements for proper assessment and recommendation, which will in turn contribute to de-demonize this issue, to remove unnecessary passions from the debate, and to consider this potential for cooperation between two shores, the two shores of the Mediterranean, a cooperation that will be refounded on shared values and on a shared dialogue among public decision makers, but also among societies. We are meeting today so as to adopt shared perspectives on the mobility of migrations from our from this sea, this calm, this wave-free sea, apparently, but which is suffering strong turbulences of all natures, geopolitical, environmental, human turbulences. And this exposes this area to a great amount of uncertainty with regard to the future and the hierarchy of the large regions of this world, which are going through a process of reconfiguration during the post-pandemic. So this is a crucial moment which prompts us to engage ourselves in the issues of migration with calm, with serenity, and which invite us to recognize migration with all its faces, even those of the younger. And this is a phase which is the one that is the least known of the migration flows. And this research, which we are going to embrace together with other partners with regards to migration and mobility, we need to consider this distinction between these two related concepts and which analyze the different flows, but there are different qualitative appreciations in connection with both of them. So this invites us to reinforce our knowledge starting from the fact-based basis for migration, especially connected with the younger population. And also we need to find out about the conditions and facilitate mobility for younger people, for example, for higher learning and professional training, and throughout training cycles. We should also reflect together on the diversity of skills that the young population has in the Mediterranean and which can complement each other. And we also need to reflect upon how we can create mechanisms which recognize the qualifications of the younger population so as to better integrate them into the migrant flows and to better integrate the specificities and the expectations of the younger population in the migration policies. So, well, these are some of the issues that pose challenges and which also offer opportunities for the mobility of the young. So I wish that you will have a wonderful, fruitful meeting, which will, without a doubt, open the door to other initiatives that may be embraced by the co-organizers. So thank you very much. And I will now give the floor to to Mr. Moussef Aderkawi, who is going to provide us with a brief introduction. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Abdelkrim. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, experts and professors, dear participants. It's a pleasure for me to participate in this very important webinar organized by two prestigious institutions, the CMI and the Policy Center for the New South, on the issue of migration and mobility. This, it goes without saying that this is an extremely important topic, and it is part and parcel of the priorities of the cooperation agenda, especially concerning the two shores of the Mediterranean. Today, we have a high-level panel of experts which will discuss the challenges associated to this issue, but it is also an occasion to envisage the best pathways to encourage a new model for mobility, especially the mobility concerning the younger population, a model that is constructive, that is mutually beneficial, and that may contribute to build a stable and prosperous regional space. As you know, our Mediterranean region has big challenges to face, which are the results of significant changes and that are getting accelerated. But these two institutions have analyzed these problems in quite a big detail in their publications over the past years. So basically what we need to do is to reconsider models for cooperation and also to consider approaches on co-development and the co-construction of public policies that need to be innovative and that focus on the young and on their aspirations. So this is connected not only with the identification of economic and financial linkages between the countries in both shores, but it also has to do with the consolidation of exchanges and human and immaterial linkages. In fact, the promotion of mobility of skills and talents in the framework of a migration dynamic that is a virtuous cycle will foster the complementariness of the countries in both shores. There are two research initiatives that bear witness to the benefits of mobility, and they propose very concrete recommendations so as to be able to build this new model for the mobility of the younger population. The construction of this model might represent a big leverage for developing human capital in the regions, especially the capital involved in the younger population, so as to reinforce their employability and also their chances for tolerance and progress. Human capital is tightly connected with mobility. It was posted by Morocco in its 2037 vision within the framework of priority cooperation in the Mediterranean space. In this 2035, model, there are the students and researchers from Africa are considered, and as well as the contribution that the Moroccans can make to development projects in the country. So this entails business opportunities, scientific competences, and also managerial abilities, so as to be able to walk hand in hand with the transformation pathway of the country. With regard to migration, Morocco has always taken a human standpoint, and it has also has had an equanimous standpoint in connection with socio-economic initiatives as well as security-related issues. This position deserves respect and admiration, and this is the result of His Majesty, the King of Morocco, in connection with the migration issue. And there's also an Morocco observatory that has pioneered this in connection with migration. I would like to say that when it comes to academic and technical cooperation, Morocco has other countries in the continent that Morocco has received students from more than 10 years. That is to say that more than 87% of students that have received scholarships. There is a large number of students that have benefited from a capacity building program as part of technical cooperation. And Morocco has received students from 47 countries in Africa. So, after the pandemic, we need to rebuild the economies on both shores on sustainable and inclusive basis. So this is an excellent unparalleled situation to revisit the different aspects of the debate on migration. The CMI and the PCNS are ready to carry out a well-balanced debate so as to clarify different decision-related aspects through in-depth reflections and innovative propositions that will have a forward-looking attitude. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you success during this webinar. Right. Now, Miss Blanca, thank you, Mr. Aderkawi, for this in-depth reflection on the model perspectives, on the perspectives on new modes of mobility and these changes that are taking place. Miss Blanca Moreno Dodson, you have the floor. You're muted. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Aderkawi, dear friends. I'm so happy about being with you today on behalf of this CMI. I'm really happy to see this partnership and this collaboration with PCNS, which has started today. And this is just the beginning of a beautiful friendship and a collaboration efforts that will provide very fruitful results. The subject that we couldn't have chosen a more important topic. Human capital and the mobility of the younger population are part and parcel of socio-economic transformation in the region. The CMI recognizes this investment on the younger population as the key for the development in the region and also for social stability. The inclusion of the younger people is key in order for the different countries to have a climate of peacefulness. It is also necessary that education and social inclusion addressed to the younger population should be based on quality, employability, and also the possibility for mobility amongst the countries, whether it be the university where these people come from, the quality of education that needs to be recognized, the mobility from one country to another, the recognition of university degrees, the possibility of doing internships, and the possibility of visiting, having visits between universities. So the goal here is to have top quality education for these younger people that will later join the labor market, the job market. So it's not just about the quality of education, but also socio-emotional competences such as autonomy, flexibility, critical mindsets, and team work abilities. These are all skills that can help the younger population to join the job market, which is an extremely dynamic market and which changes because of social, economic, or environmental variables. Mobility, therefore, is a key element in order for the younger population to acquire these soft skills, but also in order for them to be able to respond to their freedom aspirations in the region. As part of the activities of the CMI on this topic, human capital and mobility, we have concretely worked on the production and dissemination of technical materials, analytical documents. Today, we will share one of these efforts, which was prepared by a task force called Cycle Économique, and which gathers a large number of personalities from the region with one specific objective: changing ideas and finding joint solutions for the challenges that the region is facing. This effort is specifically consecrated to mobility and migration. I would like to underscore that the CMI, the Center for Mediterranean Integration, hopes to establish a linkage between technical skills and incubation of projects. So it is here that we find the links between the academia and the business world. So doing this in the study period, in the courses, is very important. I would like to also emphasize that the center has a digital platform for regional investment projects that involve civil society. So I hope that this digital platform, which was created last year, will be able to help us to sustain these entrepreneurs who are students, who have wonderful ideas, and that need technical support from the beginning, or in order to be able to have some seed capital in order to get started. So I would like to underscore the desire of the CMI to have this relationship between the academia and incubation in the business milieu. Finally, last but not least, the CMI has recently joined efforts with UNOPS, which is the agency that provides its support. And recently, we have introduced a significant reform to our governance. So Morocco was chosen as the president of the surveillance committee in the center. So I am happy to receive the director, Mr. Kawi, and also Mr. Idan, who will be representing Morocco as part of the surveillance committee and who will be orienting the center towards finding solutions to the challenges that worry us so much today. So thank you so much for your participation, and I wish you a very fruitful webinar. Thank you.
Merci, Madame Blanca-Moreno.
Thank you, Ms. Blanca Moreno. Thank you for having shared your perspective and for having underscored the relationship between human capital, mobility, regulations. So these are human topics that speak to us and that are part and parcel of developments in the benefit of the younger population. So there are initiatives, therefore, and a series of case studies, and above and beyond the case studies, there is a number of platforms that are oriented towards the younger population. So the goal is to work together so as to consolidate this framework that will favor overcoming the current difficulties and facilitating mobility of the younger population, which is, of course, something that will be beneficial for both shores. So now let's move to the first session, which has to do with the mobility of young people in the Mediterranean, aspirations and constraints. We are going to give the floor now to Mr. Abdelhak Bassou, and after to Julia Marquesina, the Human Capital Senior Program Manager of CMO. Thank you. Thank you. I think everything has been said without everything that will take place in the coming sessions has already been said. However, I would like to focus on the subjects having to do with migration and mobility, but especially I would like to lay an emphasis on the relationships in the Mediterranean in general.
Fernand Braudel, il disait qu'il faut prendre du champ et de la hauteur pour comprendre ce qui se passe en Méditerranée. Alors, prendre de la hauteur, ce n'est pas seulement de l'altitude.
So it is not just about considering this perspective, but I think that we need to be interested in those vital elements of migration and mobility, as well as really focusing on these approaches instead of resorting to selfishness. And we must also make efforts to prioritize the region towards the common good. With this perspective that can be either literal or metaphorical, we suddenly and all of a sudden realize that there is a proximity between the south and the north shore of the Mediterranean, and this proximity has to do with common points between both shores. If we think about the current situation, the Mediterranean Sea in its northern shore has maybe overcome the issue of prosperity and is now focusing on security. And the southern shore is a shore that is still dreaming of this development and of this prosperity. Because of the experience that we've had, we have discovered that this security requires the creation of bridges between both shores to ensure the stability and the development and the prosperity that is sought in the south cannot happen if the north does not provide its support. So everyone has something that they're looking for in the other shore. Furthermore, each can be at the service of the other as well. So I believe that this is what we're looking for in this search and in this meeting, in this webinar that has been organized jointly by the CMI and the PCNS. The purpose of which is to identify the strengths and the synergies between the north and the south of the Mediterranean, as well as the channels of communication and exchange, in order to be able to address everything that will deploy these common pathways and that will ensure communication. If we go back to the subject matter of today's webinar, I would like to mention the fact that we know that these types of spaces do not get old, I think, because I think the Mediterranean space within international geopolitics maybe is, some believe that is old news, but I do not believe that. I think that this is always, the importance of this geopolitical space is always renewed because it has always been led by people who have focused on these issues. And I think that the young people of each new generation reinvigorate this space and provide it with a newfound energy. So it is within this category that all of our support has to be placed in this process. And I believe that the two scientific papers that will be presented today and that we have the honor of being presented throughout the two sessions will be focused on this Mediterranean youth that really has the task of renewing the Mediterranean space, and of course to mention the obstacles and the challenges of mobility and migration that they face. But they will mention as well the mechanisms that bring us hope and will identify the needs for support that are in the area. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this invitation to really take a high stand with respect to these issues, and it really makes us reflect on the model and the space of the Mediterranean, and I think always from a modern, current perspective. I think this is a strategic long-term perspective to face the different challenges of this Mediterranean basin. It is also a call for synergies and for a complementarity between the north and the south shores, even if the priorities are different and some differences persist. But in the bond between two shores, this search for prosperity needs to be shared, and challenges must be addressed in a joint manner. I think that communication channels are essential, and like I said, this is a living space. This is not an outdated space, and as a living, dynamic space, it allows for you opportunities for the youth, for the young people of the Mediterranean to give it more depth and to provide it with its own identity as an evolving process. Madame Giulia Marchesini, you have the floor, and I apologize if I maybe did not pronounce your name correctly. Giulia Marchesini will be given the floor now to discuss these issues for the first session. Go ahead. Hello, and thank you very much for giving me the floor. First of all, I would like to thank our friends who are joining us today, because I believe this is a collective work, and the Center for Mediterranean Integration is carrying this flag, focusing on youth in the Mediterranean. All of our friends are here, and I think this only proves how the center really is able to reach consensus and put these elements together to renew our gaze and our perspective on youth. What we did was to bring up the subject of youth with a perspective of mobility. When I say we because this is the result of the collective work on issues of the Mediterranean with the support of high-level experts from the north and the south of the Mediterranean, and also from different sectors. So we will be hearing from experts from all these different sectors that I would like to thank in advance. We played the role of really running, it was like a conductor of an orchestra, and we had musicians who really played their instruments well, if I can use a metaphor. The issue is without a doubt very serious, and youth is really the focus of attention in our regions. And therefore, mobility has something that really allows us to look at this youth and identify how it can offer opportunities so that these young people can become the drivers of prosperity. The process of transformation is necessary in the Mediterranean to ensure that the youth can take that role as drivers of change. I think that the COVID-19 pandemic, more than ever, has made us realize the dimension of and the central role of mobility in our society in the Mediterranean. The pandemic has restricted mobility, borders were closed, and all of a sudden mobility had to be reinvented because, of course, young people and humans in general cannot live without mobility. And of course, if this is restricted due to health issues, we had to reinvent ways of changing and exchanging knowledge and other aspects as well. So we were able to see how the world was reinvented especially by the youth, with a central role for youth in this change. When there is a certainty, however, there are other opportunities to be leveraged. So I would like to go back to aspirations of the youth, because this is the topic of this short introduction. The aspiration in terms of mobility is something very important for the young people. New skills now are required for the transformation of the valid model and for the transformation of the productive model that is valid today. So we run into several restrictions. There are aspirations as well as restrictions for these young people seeking to engage in change. And they must face a social order that closes up to them. That's one of the challenges they face. So they find themselves in a situation where they are not able to fully express their new capacities. And what do I mean by new capacities? I mean that the new generations today are more instructed, more cultivated, more urban, more connected than the previous generations, that is, their parents. So they are more aware of what is happening everywhere, but they are not able to find a channel to express themselves. So this lack of expression and the fact that this is not recognized has really allowed for the opportunity for them to put their capacities into action. And their capacities are sometimes not fully seized for their mainly their personal development, but then for their economic, social, and political development as well. So this situation contributes to the emergence of frustration. This leads to frustration, and that's what the young are saying. And in this policy paper, this is what is mentioned as a result of this joint work of the CMI, because this feeling of exclusion, without a doubt, it takes on different shapes and different forms. For example, just to mention an extreme example, some young people, in face of this shortage of expression channels, they might resort to extreme violence in extreme cases, of course. So the idea of developing expression channels is very important. Of course, these channels are not all the same for not all the young people. The youth, of course, share many common points, and we cannot say that in general the situation of young people in the north and the south of the Mediterranean is the same. We cannot be generic in this sense. We must recognize that there are major differences between one and the other shore. Of course, the physical distance between the north and the south is one of the points. So in this policy paper, we try to take everything into account and, of course, underline the differences, but to find, despite it all, to find that common ground in these young people from the north and the south shore, to see how together we can move forward. This includes exploring different areas of human capital, education, and the labor market. So I would like to conclude my intervention, and just to revisit one of the titles of our policy paper, we say youth is our future. And we know that, but let us not forget this. They are also are present. So nothing can stop us to start acting and to reflect upon these issues together. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much. I think that we all agree with your last statement and with your reflection and your analysis. I think it was extremely interesting. And of course, this is definitely the role of youth as a collective force that brings everyone together, focusing on common production and the issues specifically of youth and mobility. This is central in the Mediterranean policies, and without a doubt, we must know what the aspirations of the young are and what are their different aspirations with respect to the prior generations, and even to identify the differences and the common points between the young people in the North Shore and the South Shore. Issues of innovation, issues of development that we need to identify, and we need to make proposals that will really focus on the young people, and so that young people listen, that are attractive for them, and to really try to incorporate them in the discussions. Without a doubt, we need to find that common ground, and we need to move forward and continue to reflect upon how the human capital in the North and the South can contribute to this coming closer together. Thank you very much for this introduction, and I think that the main elements have been presented, and I think it's really an extraordinary richness that has been already presented in this introduction. And in session 1 and session 2, the goal is to go even deeper into these ideas and analyze them in more detail. Session 1, I will give the floor to the moderator, Madame Marchesini, once again, to present the panelists of this first session regarding the first paper of the CMI. You have the floor. Hello. Hello again. Thank you very much for giving me the floor once again. I have the honor of moderating this session to present the paper Youth Actors for Change, Rethinking Mobility. As I said before, this is a collective work for the carried out by the CMI. And it is a result of meetings that have taken place in the economic cycle, what we call the cycle économique in the center. And it also responds to commitments for new ambitions in the Mediterranean, which was established in the summit of the two shores in 2019. The working group that contributed to this work from the point of view of high-level experts included certain points that I will be presenting today. I will introduce the first speaker, Philippe Fagg. Philippe is a professor and a member emeritus of the European University Institute, and he is also the founder and the director of the Migration Policy Center. He specializes in demography, and he's going to mention the aspects of the paper that focus on demography mostly and mobility. I would like to take this opportunity to tell everyone that we have more than 70 people connecting through the different channels and platforms, so it is an honor. Philippe, you have the floor. You have approximately 20 minutes. Hello, everyone. Hello to the 70 people who are joining us and that we're not seeing, but that are connected to this video conference. Thank you very much to the two centers who invited me to present this paper on youth and mobility. Thank you very much also to the two centers. I think that this today is the first joint initiative as this webinar. I think that there are certain universal aspects that I would like to mention. In any society, in the present or in the past, mobility is associated to the youth. To be more precise, young adults, the group between 20 and 35 years of age, and is the most mobile segment of the population. This is true, and it has always been true everywhere. The arrival of Europeans to Ellis Island in the beginning of the 20th century, this also holds true for the Italian immigration in Argentina, or the Jewish immigration in the middle of the 20th century. And it also holds true for Southern Asia. If we consider the European Union and the fact that we can take the statistics of the last few years, 2015, 2020, we can see that 43.2% of the migrants within the countries of the European Union belong to this age segment, 20 to 35 years old. And the reasons why this is mostly concentrated in this age group can be maybe described by starting by three reasons, which has to do with the subject matter of today's webinar and with the work that we did within this framework. The first reason is mostly demographic. The age group, 20 to 35 years old, is the beginning of the adult life cycle. Yes, at this age, we are a young adult, and we have more responsibilities, but probably not any children yet. And we are often single, and it is more and more true that the age of marriage has increased significantly in Mediterranean countries, especially in the south of the Mediterranean. In other aspects, at this age also we have a certain autonomy that we had never had before that age, and we have like a freedom of movement that we will never have again in the future. So in that age group, all of these factors make it favorable to move about. And this is all done within the age of 20 and 35.
Secondly, we have the economic reasons. Well, we need to think about costs and benefits. Well, costs are immediate. For example, the costs of settling in a country where you may already have a network of people, but maybe you don't have it. It's also sometimes the affective, the love-related cost is underestimated. The price of leaving your homeland, right? Like your family environment, and there is another, and there are, so this is a cost that is immediate, but the benefits are also there, but the problem is they are not immediate. They are postponed, so to speak. They may happen in the middle or the longer term. So what does this mean, this difference in the time frames between the immediate costs and the postponed benefits? So that means that we may have this relationship, and we may have the impression that the future may be complicated. So the economic reasons are quite powerful for explaining why the younger population migrates more than other populations. And there is another factor which was mentioned at the beginning of this video conference, which has to do with education. The fact that between the people between 20 and 35 has just been finished, or is about to be finished, or they are in the last phases of their university education. The younger adults of today have received more school education than the previous generations, more than in their societies ever. So I'm talking about the quantity of education. I cannot judge the quality of that education, mind you. But, well, this is the comment that I would like to make, right? This association that exists between the younger population and mobility, and finally, a commonplace association that is not typical in the Mediterranean. I am going to mention 4 points quite quickly, and I will be brief because Julia has said a lot of things already. The first point has to do with the weight that the younger population has in the demographics of the southern shore of the Mediterranean. Secondly, the feeling of relative deprivation. I will talk about what relative deprivation means within the younger population nowadays in the southern countries of the Mediterranean. Thirdly, and I insist on the significance of this point because there is considerable confusion nowadays, especially the political debate, is that mobility is not necessarily migration. Mobility is much larger than migration. It is more frequent than migration. And the fourth point will be about a recommendation that I would like to make, and which is in the report on the younger population that has just been published. So first of all, demographics. The southern shore of the Mediterranean is an exceptional, it is at an exceptional moment of its demographics history. From 2010, 2020, and nowadays, if we consider all of the younger population younger than 25 in the northern shore of the Mediterranean, they are less than 20%, less than 25% of the total population. But in the southern shore, they represent more than 50% of the entire population. And this means that there are more younger people younger than 25 at the beginning represented in the southern shore of the Mediterranean. It's almost 60%. What happened in the 1980s? There was a reduction of fertility in the southern countries of the Mediterranean. This reduction became quite important in the 1980s, 1990s, and the beginning of the 21st century. So this means that the generations that followed this very numerous generation, which was born at the beginning of the 1980s, is a little bit less numerous. And those people are the young adults of today. This is the reason why the population younger than 35 is at a historical peak in the southern population on the Mediterranean. It represents almost 30% of the total population compared to less than 20% of the population in the north of the Mediterranean. So this is a marked difference. And there is a specific moment in the demographic history of this region, a proportion that is exceptionally high of younger adults in the population. This represents an opportunity and a challenge. It is a positive thing because it represents immaterial aspects such as aspirations. But economists have attempted to develop a measure of this opportunity, and this is what they call the demographic dividend. So they talk about the gift of the demographics. This explained simply, this means that when you have a very high proportion of younger adults, the ratio of the population of active age with regard to dependent ages is at its maximum. The reverse is in a minimum ratio. There are more contributors to the production than ever. So this is what the economists consider as something that is favorable for economic investments that are translated into human progress, in contrast with the demographic investment, which is investment that is conceived only in the with regards to a faster growing population. So we are at a favorable situation in which the growth of the population has been reduced, and there are investments that allow young people. Of course, there are problems with this interpretation. In order for this mechanism to work, it is necessary for younger adults to be in employment. The thing is, nowadays, if we consider the countries of the southern side of the Mediterranean, the labor market is being riddled with unemployment or by underemployment, depending on the countries. And sometimes both phenomena happen together. And this is a vicious circle that begins because of that. There are a lot of young adults that are unemployed or underemployed, and this, what does it do? It increases insatisfaction. It increases dissatisfaction because you're unemployed or because you are employed, but you consider that your salary is not high enough, that it does not compensate you for what you're doing. So we are being faced with a situation of tension that favors unrest, and this has risks, right? Because the weaker within this mechanism, the weaker population within this fragile mechanism, well, the weaker become easy targets for extremists. So here we can see a manifestation of a frequent association. It is almost universal, as a matter of fact, between this situation and political violence. In the United States, the generality or the overall manifestation of this phenomenon has been demonstrated. That is to say, these underprivileged adults, young adults, and political violence perpetrated by them. There seems to be a correlation. So the challenge is to allow the younger population to find a place in life and to satisfy their aspirations. Now, if the young adults are so numerous right now, is because fertility has been lowered. The context between this fertility has been lowered has been the increase in education. That the increase in education is the cause for the reduction in fertility. Why is that? Because the education of girls has a considerable effect on the way in which women will decide to build their families. For example, the age of marriage and the quantity of kids that they want to have, and also the consequences, because a fertility reduction implies a desire to convey more education to the kids that these women have had, right? So it is much easier to take on the costs for education than in the case of an overcrowded family. So this is something that has been described by the Gabriel Mr. Becker, the Nobel Prize for Economy in the 1960s, who spoke about the quality of education. That is, you have fewer children in order to improve their quality of education. I am sorry to talk about kids in this way, but of course, these are the words of Becker, the economist, Nobel Prize laureate. So younger people nowadays are more educated, more learned than in the past. They have ambitions that are legitimate. They are faced with the risk for frustration in this employment, this labor market that is so seriously affected. And there are other societal aspects that may block them, like, for example, access to political participation, and so on and so forth. So this situation, which is riddled with opposed consequences, in this situation, we need to focus on positive development and derail the risks for violence. I am going to move quickly to the second point, which is the feeling of relative deprivation. This is a term that I took from Robert Merton, an American sociologist. These are relative deprivations that exist especially in the southern shore. Of course, in the northern shore, of course, I'm always talking about the younger population, right? So nowadays, we are in a context which is unprecedented. It is the context of the globalization of communication. Young people in a given country are exposed to the situation that other peers of theirs are experiencing in other countries. And if they compare themselves with the peers in other countries, they may have the feeling that they could do better, that they are being faced with a situation that is unfavorable. So, for example, I would be better elsewhere than I am here. So this is a frequent emotion and feeling that these people have. This is especially shown by surveys, especially in the among the younger population in Mediterranean countries. This feeling of relative deprivation may declench, may generate two different things. Well, one of them is revolution, so to speak, or unrest. Well, this is something that we saw everywhere in all the countries in the southern and eastern shores of the Mediterranean in the 2010s, and there was this was quite represented by the younger population. Well, it is a very important context that we need to take into account. And migrations, leaving because of revolution or just leaving, migration is a very high phenomenon, a very heavy phenomenon. There are several decades that have seen migrations happen, but the stock of migrants, in 2019, if we consider the Arab countries in the Mediterranean, there is a considerable stock of migrants with regard to the population. Over 23 million people from these countries are currently living in another country. So this is a very high percentage. And of course, there are exceptional situations. For example, the Syrians, a lot of Syrian citizens are living abroad, but there are also structural situations that are involved here. This 9.9% of the population in this area is compared to a little bit more than 3% with regards to the rest of the world. So it is higher than the median in the rest of the world. These migrants are also a non-representative group of the original population, and they are more educated than the general population. That is why people speak about the brain escape or the fleeing of brains, right? So I am not going to delve into the details of this question, but it is a debate on the fact that this migration of highly educated young people and the loss of valuable resources, and also the transference of public resources to richer countries, because there are many countries that have educated their young based on public expenses, on the public budget. So of course it's a loss. And of course there are also there is also another proven aspect. Nowadays, is it for example, being well educated in a southern country of the Mediterranean is a very rare resource. There's also the phenomenon of another phenomenon of migration in which there are migrants that come back. The migrants that come back, the returning migrants, can contribute human and social capital thanks to the enriching experience that they had abroad. If I take what happens in Europe, the immigrants in Europe, there is 53% of immigrants in the EU arrive before they are 28 years old. Many of them are kids of the migrants and others are students. In all the cases, they arrive at an age in which their education has just finished or is currently happening. So their migration is followed. I am not going... in many cases, I mentioned the percentage for 53%. In many cases, it's about following their education in the host countries. So migration contributes to the increase or the enhancement of human capital. So the political message is quite difficult in connection with this issue. A number of people speak about this fleeing of brains. Is it necessary to consider that it is a wrong thing that that the policies of the countries of origin should work against this migration vis-a-vis the migration of people that are not so learned, which is not so controlled. In the destination countries, this could be translated by rules of ethical recruitment, that is to say, to establish some control of this migration. People that are against this hypothesis have strong arguments as well. And one of these arguments is, and I invite you to reflect on this, is that the mobility of migration is the exercise of individual freedoms. It's empowering the young to go wherever they want. Favoring mobility means increasing regional and international integration. The benefit of mobility, including the mobility of university-educated people, is something that includes them, of course, and it is less present than the people that are more vulnerable, so to speak. Thirdly, in my presentation, there is a confusion nowadays in language, a terminology confusion between mobility and migration. Mobility is about international mobility. It's about going through frontiers. And migration is about going through frontiers and establishing and settling on the other side of this frontier for a relatively long period. We could speak like for a year, or longer, or a minimum of 3 months for a short-term migration, for example. But there are people that are migrants. I said that 3.5% of the worldwide population is a population of migrants, and the percentage is higher for the southern shore of the Mediterranean, 9.9%. But this is infrequent. It is not only small because vis-a-vis the proportion of the population, but in contrast, leaving is something that happens quite frequently. Leaving in order to come back, this is something that happens quite frequently. There is a survey that is apparently interesting and which is used quite a bit by politicians. I'm taking it with a pinch of salt anyway, which is the survey by Gallup, an American company, on potential migration. This is a survey that covers 150 countries and that poses the question of younger adults. Actually poses 3 questions. Do you wish to settle for a long time in another country? The second question is, do you have plans to settle in the following 12 months? That is to say, here we can see the idea that this desire, this wish is going to be materialized. And thirdly, are you currently preparing to migrate? The Gallup Institute has a net potential index for migration, considering all countries in the world, with regard to the wish. There is a difference between 2 wishes: the wishes of the citizens of another country that want to get into a country, and on the other hand, the desire of the same citizens or the citizens of that country with regard to leaving that country. So this is the potential net migration index. If we consider the Mediterranean and the contrast between North and South is very, very clear. All the countries in the North have a positive migration index, so there are more people that want to come to those countries than the people that want to leave them. And in contrast, the southern countries have a negative index. The differences are very, very important, and they go from minus 40%, minus 31% for Syria and Algeria, respectively, when it comes to leaving, the desire to leave, which is prevalent, up to plus 40% for Portugal or plus 24% for France, where the index, the migration index, is positive. This means that the difference between the population that wants to come to that country and the ones that want to leave.
Mais il faudrait essayer d'aller au point recommandation si c'est possible.
D'accord, d'accord, mais enfin, je suis désolé, mais on a commencé un petit
Of course, sorry, we started a bit late, but I'm about to wrap up. So we must not mix these two terms, mobility and migration, because 47 million travelers, according to the European Union, come from the South Shore since 2018, but only 170,000 were new immigrants from the South Shore to the North Shore. So we are in a situation where it's very important not to confound the desire for mobility and international migration. And the recommendation that I would like to make, and that can be found in this paper, has to do with a simple fact. Mobility is an essential human right. And here I would like to call your attention, and it's the fact that there is a difference between two aspects of mobility: leaving one's country and entering the other country. Article 13 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights establishes that any person has a right to leave their own country and to go back to that country. So there is a right that is enshrined in the Human Rights Declaration. The problem is that there is no symmetrical right to enter the other country, because the sovereign states and immigration and migration is not a right. And so in the Global Compact of Marrakesh in 2018 has to do with the rights of migrants, but this has to consider the whole perspective. So I think that this is an important thing to consider. We must also think about history. Today, we need a visa to circulate, and these visas are more and more rejected and refused, especially considering the political situation in the Mediterranean. And we didn't used to need a visa. All of these countries could go back and forth without a visa. And one could go back without a visa and stay, according to the country, 30 days or 60 days or even 90 days in some countries. So this was conceived at a time when there was great economic prosperity and as a way to strengthen academic ties and other forms of relationship. Today, this is no longer the case. Today, we have a need for a visa, and there are restrictions that are very, very significant and very important. So my suggestion and my recommendation in this report is that we should reestablish a liberalization of the visas in the Mediterranean zone between the countries of the south and the north of the Mediterranean. The political developments of Mediterranean countries can reach this integration, and this is not a utopia, because this has existed, this has been the case in the past, and this also exists in the present of countries more towards the east. And so this is the recommendation that is made in this paper. I think it would be about following the example of what we observe between the European Union and our eastern countries, Georgia and Armenia. This is, in a way, the recommendation for a free circulation charter for the Mediterranean. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Philippe. And thank you. It was really interesting to hear from you, and thank you for presenting so clearly the guidelines that you wrote in this report. And I would just like to mention the fact that it's true that this charter for free circulation in the Mediterranean could be part of our present, and it could be a means, like you said, a means to increase integration if we act also on youth and focus on increasing mobility. So without a doubt, I believe that this is an essential instrument. And like you said, this is not that far from reality, and it was the case in the recent past, so it could become our present. I would like to now give the floor to Dora Ben Alaya. She is also part of our work group while writing this policy paper, and Dora Ben Alaya is a senior lecturer at the University of Tunis El Manar and the Higher Institute of Human Sciences of Tunisia. And she will be presenting the psychosocial aspects of youth with specific focus on the role of education and human capital in this context that we have just described. You have the floor. Thank you very much, Julia, and hello to everyone. It is a pleasure to be here today. I will be focusing on 3 points. First of all, it is the experience of the youth in the South Shore. I will be explaining certain aspects that have to do with their lives, and also what has to do with the educational system and the implications in the obstacles for the well-being of the youth, and the continuation of the common problems like clandestine immigration, etc. And thirdly, a revision of what mobility could contribute in the Mediterranean to constitute one of the most powerful means to address the current common problems. With respect to the first point, the experience of the youth. In Tunisia, the majority of the research was conducted here in my country, and I have a certain level of knowledge of the results of the studies that were carried out in Algeria. And of course, I cannot speak of all the countries in the South Shore, so I want to specify this. But there are things that are shared, that are common without a doubt, because these young people are located in contexts that have or follow the same logic. Regarding this first point and the experience of the youth, we can say that there is a discomfort that is expressed by the young people, and they are not at ease, not only because of the regime of the dictatorship, or not just because of Mubarak in Egypt, but also regarding other aspects. So regarding the expectations, they have many different expectations. And also another aspect to be considered is the persistence of this feeling of being relatively deprived of certain freedoms. This is not an absolute thing, but it's something that is prevalent and that is built together with the conditions that they perceive in others. In the North, for example, in other social classes, and also the rural sector versus a city, or a certain neighborhood versus others in the city. So the lack of satisfaction is very important at the point, because there is an economic and material dimension, of course, but also what is expressed in this manner is located first in the feeling of not feeling recognized, not feeling fulfilled, and therefore to be located like at the margins of the world. So this negative experience is not limited to economic and material realities, but is also subject or considered from a symbolic perspective and psychosocial perspective as well. As a result, the economic dimension is usually the only aspect considered officially when we talk about the marginalized populations in the South, and even in the North as well. That's the official perspective. It's a lack of material conditions. But I think that changing this vision is already a revolution of the current paradigms when dealing with the problems that are associated with the youth in this area. Furthermore, and this is also another aspect to be considered, and it is not just about the injustices, the inequalities, or the objective deprivations, but rather the feeling of them being deprived of things which are not subject to the real conditions. So in the level of representation and in the level of perception, if we do not take into account these symbolic considerations and representational perspectives, if we do not take them into account, these strategies developed are not adequate and are not effective. And therefore, the lack of effectiveness of numerous strategies that have been developed so far in Northern Africa. Regarding immigration and illegal immigration in general. So this feeling and this perception of lack of representation is linked to different social categories and is different between men and women and North and South in terms of their perception. So the representations and the perceptions are not independent and are not isolated. Yes, it is something that is always connected between the groups. In general, it's a relationship that is between that person who dominates and the person who is dominated. Yes, there is an issue, an ego, of course, but there are also real, palpable conditions. So these intergroup relations give sense to these conditions and provide a sense of identity and also drive certain behaviors. Violent behaviors or the resorting to illegal immigration. The results of recent studies that were carried out in 2020 show that more than half of young individuals that were surveyed had a negative perception of their living conditions, but also of the state and social ties. So a society from a global perspective. So these are just quick numbers. For example, in Tunisia, 73.9% of the young people who were surveyed between the ages of 18 and 29 years of age, 73.9% believe that they were not heard, that the voice were not heard. Another percentage believe that this feeling, and 62% that they are deprived of certain freedoms or issues, and another percentage that are subject to injustices. 75% were marginalized, and 56% were subject to inequalities. So an important aspect is that the majority of young people are not the drivers of their own fate, and they find obstacles to fulfill their goal in life, and this has an impact on their projections or their projections towards the future, and of course has a strong impact on the life of these individuals. As I was saying before, this relationship between the different groups and the role it has in the behaviors observed are in itself, and this is what makes it so complex, yes, to understand these experiences of these young people, is that there is a certain group represented that are in themselves restricted with respect to spatial barriers, and this overlaps with other social barriers, and this is where the feeling of mobility is effective. So the position in space takes different meanings through different real or symbolic oppositions. For example, we have an opposition between region of the same country, which are economically and culturally either central or peripheral. We observe that in the countries of the South, there are regions that are completely excluded and marginalized and are behind in comparison with the center. The center can be the capital, for example. In Tunisia, we have an opposition between the center and the coast, between the center, the north and the south, etc. We also have an opposition between peripheral and urban areas. So like peripheral neighborhoods or the suburbs that are considered, we call it in French the banlieue. So it's this is sort of always in the periphery. And originally they had been constituted based on the construction of anarchic structures, but this is no longer the case. But their history and their social categories are quite established with respect to these social groups. Finally, we have an opposition between North Shore and South Shore of the Mediterranean. And this is, of course, the dichotomy that is at the core or at the center of the greatest frustration. So there is a lack, what they mention is that they feel these social barriers and that within these conditions, succeeding is not a project that can be constructed over time, but rather a miracle that could occur to them thanks to displacement, a sudden mobility, or a change in space and geography. So it is that change that will maybe mean a progress forward for these individuals, at least this in the representation. So in other terms, the spatial barriers are one of the key factors of this ill of feeling so at odds with their reality, and everything that has to do with a life project, a professional project is affected. And there are restrictions to mobility in general, and the reason for these for this progress is considered a miracle, and the difficulty to produce a project for their lives is deeply affected. This is connected to the feeling that events that affect individuals are not determined by their own actions, but rather by external factors, and they have no control over these external factors. So this means that many times they resort to idea of maybe chance or opportunity or coincidence or maybe the intervention of the state. So there is a sort of lack of empowerment. Yes, they feel impotent in the face of these life events. So I believe all these issues are very important when analyzing the behaviors in the educational and professional settings with the perspective, with the time perspective as well. So this power to act on their own events and that feeling that they cannot act over their own events has a deep effect in the future educational perspectives. This impotency that is acquired can be recognized because the individual is faced to a situation where they are not at the level of controlling anything that happens to them, and they end up abandoning any attempt to control what happens to them in different situations. So this is an effect that has a role in school failure, school dropout, and has an effect also in the social category and on their health. So it really, the effects of this lack of power over themselves has very far-reaching consequences. And it also has to do that this acquired impotency is the reason for depression and other mental health issues. So we see clearly that these effects, which originally were only spatial and social, have repercussions that are very deep, very profound on the mental state of these individuals. Of course, there are strategies that are developed by the individuals, and not everyone resorts to extreme violence. Not everyone resorts to clandestine immigration or alcohol, or do not become alcoholics. Of course, there are strategies that can be deployed in the face of this feeling of exclusion. And for example, there can be options, for example, resorting to their communities, their football team, or, their vision of the world seen from this perspective, and feeling, the distinction between themselves and the rest of the world. In our country is, for example, between Francophone Tunisia and the Arab-speaking part of the country. So the strategies deployed sometimes are repressed from their inception. And in other terms, even when the young people make an effort to try to integrate, at the end of the day, they are confronted with an opposition, with obstacles when it comes to integration. And the solutions that they end up finding is, for example, I'm going to start rapping or doing breakdance or doing graffiti or other manifestations which are considered dangerous. Yes, and this is considered dangerous without even considering them. So we always have the impression, or there is a general perception, that they are violent by nature, these young people. And the solution in general is to regulate them. They are considered deviants, marginalized people, and with marginalizing behaviors. So they are invisibilized by decision makers as violent. And what's even worse is that once these strategies are reappropriated by the dominating groups, and you think of rap, for example. Yes, there are rappers who have become celebrities, and all of a sudden they no longer become to this category. Yes, they are dispossessed, and they do not have the possibility of accessing this. It's a paradox, yes, because they were the beginnings of these processes. And this is what we do in these processes. And so the worst thing is that the expressions of these young people in the South, who are sometimes faced with restrictions to express themselves, and the processes that describe the conditions are not understandable for them, and they are not understandable for the decision makers, and not for the actors in charge to transmit the knowledge. And even worse, the actors of the education sector, as well as the decision makers at an institutional level, represent the conditions that they're trying to fight. This includes inequality in opportunities and marginalization.
Let me take the example of the educational system because it is our matter of interest. Okay. First of all, the education system, several of its aspects have become completely obsolete. First of all, for example, the authority relationship with their parents and the younger people has become completely inappropriate in the university and the family environment. There is also a will to maintain, unconsciously perhaps, a status quo, which is founded on a value that is given to the age. That is to say, the more age you have, the wiser you are. And there's also other aspects that are considered, such as the color of skin. For example, skin color does play a very important role, no matter how people try to deny it, and social class, which has a very important role to play, much more than what has been observed in the northern shore of the Mediterranean. And now hierarchy and legitimation of these categories are being questioned more and more by this younger generation. And they are not even aware of the processes that took place in the past. And there is a big pragmatic paradox. So we know but paradox creates politics. paradoxes create madness in certain conditions. So this creates a big pragmatic paradox, which makes some values lose sense. And finally, amongst the various points that I have dealt with, there is the exclusion of new channels of information, like, for example, social media, etc. So all of this leads us to reflect on some aspects having to do with contents, methods, channels, etc., but especially on the relationship that relies or that brings together the educators and the beneficiaries of the knowledge, the students. So this is not independent of content and methods, because the labor market can also be seen as a place where knowledge is acquired, and the educators would so there's also precarization, for example, for the salaried employees, and also the onset of flexible work methods demand a lot of adaptability. For example, it is also indispensable for the younger generation to be flexible, but also to be creative and to become autonomous. So the educational imperative becomes it becomes a way for them, for the students, to discover a world that the educators themselves do not know themselves. So it is not just about making other people learn, but also to help students to develop their autonomy, because there are aspects of the world that the educators are unaware of. Besides, it is not any longer about adapting oneself to the job, but also transforming the job. That is why entrepreneurship is playing a very important role, and it is becoming a major model in the future. So because of this, for example, the progress of formal or non-formal knowledges and creativity is thinking out of the box, for example, something that does not correspond to the standards, to the usual way of doing things. So this is going to be one of the incontestable and unavoidable objectives of education. There are educators that are against this trend and imperative, because this is something that questions their own social status as the holders, the repositories of incontestable knowledge, and so on and so forth. Apart from these imperatives, there are a number of basics that educational institutions cannot work anymore. Like, for example, there is a privilege that is still placed on the classification of students in schools. Tolerance is another aspect, opening up to other environments, including other social classes, which have become assets, not just in the world of work, but also in all the spheres of life. So the classical pedagogical postulations or premises do not apply the rules as they are nowadays. So I would like to come back to the paradox that I was speaking before. Well, of course, there are conditions in order for doing this, but it's quite simple. There is the issue of the relationship of the educators, as well as the obstacles placed on the community with some aspects of knowledge that they are fit to convey. For example, the notion of citizenship, democratic values, human rights, etc. So there is a paradox between the contents transmitted by the educator and the postures that adopted by the educator himself, through which these contents are transmitted or conveyed. There is a total paradox. These are contents, therefore, that are conveyed in an authoritarian fashion, in a way that is not respectful of the beneficiary of education, because of age, because of sex, because of social category. So So that makes all the contents, that creates a vacuum in the contents, and it discredits the educator. So therefore there is a total loss of sense. So the educator is not credible or is delegitimized, and he's no longer considered as a moral reference. He's not any longer considered as an ethical reference. I am going to give you some examples. For example, in the South, this becomes evident through the ban of real debates, there's a say on which affects the basic postulates of knowledge, because apparently the sacred would be attacked. For example, there is no single educator on the school level. None of them will dare defy a number of beliefs in favor of science. And this, of course, has given rise to a lot of violence. Of course, there is the infantilizing patriarchal attitude that is perpetuated. And I would just mention the timing. We have to switch to conclusion in just a few minutes, so you need to be brief, please. So I am going to skip a number of points. Thank you. So there are other paradoxes as well. For example, paradoxes that affect refugees or migrants. There are a number of contradictions, like the disrespect for example, people that want to protect the environment. So, well, that is something that is also present. For example, there are acts of discrimination, inequalities, precariousness in the social scale, also biodiversity loss, consumer society. So all of that is all about paradoxes. It's about contradictions. So I am going to quickly move to the conclusions and the recommendations. And I would like to mention mobility finally. In this context, the mobility of the younger generation in the Mediterranean, I would like to insist that it happens in a collaborative fashion. It is a win-win relationship. So the younger generation will play a crucial role with regards to an alternative view of their own conditions of life and the world itself. The development of their skills through contact and the change of the regular framework in which knowledge is conveyed. When I talk about mobility, I'm not talking just about mobility from the south towards the north, but vice versa, and from the south to the south itself. So there is the need for building a shared space, and this notion of the shared space is something that cannot happen without mobility. How can we envisage a shared space if the right to circulate in the space does not exist? So I agree with Philippe. We need to fight against violent extremism. We need to unify circulation by incorporating mobility elements in the school and the superior and the higher university settings, because the northern shore would lose their status as a dreamland. And it is a life project, like for many people, a lifeline in its own right for everyone. The Mediterranean would lose its role as a barrier, and whereby the north is seen as a fortress, something that is practically inaccessible, and the north would lose its position of domination in the relationship in the north-south relationship, which would give rise to resentment. And also the feeling of relative deprivation. So we should not minimize identity limitations. So this would also allow visibilizing groups, different groups, and some of their mobilities. For example, we need to check out where mobility reinforces the chances for creativity, not just in the educational setting. For example, the contests that are addressed to school kids in order to address a number of shared problems in the Mediterranean space. And there is also an inductive movement that would entail creating spaces which would allow school kids as well as university students to bring about new ideas, new projects without this being related to problems necessarily, but allowing a certain amount of creativity, a sort of explosion, which would not just be limited to a geographic space or a specific time frame. So I'm going to stop right here because I know that there are other aspects, such as the creation of Mediterranean modules in the courses, in the school and university courses, in order to foster Mediterranean-oriented learning or lessons. This is something that is not being proposed, but for example, Mediterranean modules that would have to do with shared history. Nowadays, in the official discourse, there is a dichotomy between North and South, and we tend to forget the continuity, civilization-wise, that exists between the North and the South. For example, the role of Averroes and other Arabian philosophers, the role of the Jewish population in Spain, for example. All of that would help towards modifying and displacing the categories of belonging that these younger generations use in order to give shape to their environment, their context, and to develop behaviors that are quite risky and that are not adapted to the current world. Well, I'm going to stop here. There are many things that I have not been able to touch upon. Hopefully, I will be able to develop them later. Thank you, Dora, for your presentation and this psychosocial interpretation that is so important to consider. We need to deconstruct, therefore, what our social reality entails nowadays, so as to be able to reconstruct a reality that is more fitting to the contents that we need to convey in the educational milieu. I agree, we have so many things to say on both sides of the Mediterranean, so we think that we are going to have a continuation after this first encounter, because we do not have any more time nowadays to go deeper into things. But I would like to express my gratitude to my two panelists for this session and for the wonderful presentations that you have shared on the young actors of change. I am going to move to the next panel. I know there are participants that need to leave us, so without further ado, I am going to give the floor to my colleague for the moderation and the facilitation of the next panel. Thank you, Dora and Philippe, for your interventions. Thank you, Julia. I am Ivan Martin. I am the facilitator of this session. I have prepared a brief introduction, but we have the right to the very relevant insights and the academic insights that Dora and Philippe have shared with us from an angle that is both demographic and psychosocial. And right now we are going to change the angle just a tad. If I properly understood the intentions of my colleagues, we are going to have a more pragmatic kind of approach based on experience and based on the perspectives of the younger generation. We are going to have two speakers, Adnan Adoui Amal El-Wasif. Amal El-Wasif is International Relations Specialist from the PCNS. So he's a dear colleague of mine, and she has 2 master degrees in connection with international relationships from the EU, and she has also been trained in the Collège d'Europe, and she has also been trained in the University of Grenoble. She is going to present a document that she produced a short time ago, some time ago, but it is very valid. Right now, it has to do with the development of communities in the Mediterranean, especially the younger generation, and also with a focus of mobility learning and research incubators and obstacles. Adnan Adjoui, the second speaker, he's going to speak in the first place. He is the chairman of the Moroccan Center for Innovation and Social Entrepreneurship. He has co-created, has co-founded this center, and for a number of years he was like the chief visionary officer. So he is a professional guru, so to speak. Over the past 2 years, he has been member of the Royal Commission on the New Models for Development, which was mentioned before by Mr. Adel Kawi. And apart from being a member of this commission, he has participated in discussions that are very similar to the one nowadays. So Adnan, I am going to give you the floor. Please speak for 15 minutes top. We are going to try and find a more agile way of conveying knowledge during this session. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes.
Centre Marseille pour moi qui est un centre framework pour toutes ces questions. Alors moi, je n'ai pas une casquette de chercheur à la différence de plusieurs intervenants. J'ai plutôt une casquette d'entrepreneur et d'activiste qui jongle.
We have entrepreneurs and activists that have to do with issues of inclusion and specifically in the Mediterranean, and especially with respect to issues of socioeconomic inclusion, capacity development, and creation of discussion platforms. So this issue of mobility, of course, since the beginning has focused on issues of how the policies change and the idea to consolidate these practices and the structure of the knowledge, for example, in universities and association that has started with as a reference point, especially in Northern Africa. Right now, we are seeing more and more incubators, more researchers that want to do research in action and entrepreneurship in both sides. So to summarize my intervention, the first thing is that if we want to transform the role of youth and inclusion, we need to build this through an egalitarian, an equal approach. Access to knowledge is no longer only a matter of something isolated. It is really something consolidated, and in the COVID-19 pandemic, we realize that there are no longer such a thing as barriers, yes? And of course, inclusion is important, and inclusion is in terms of the language, in terms of technology, and in terms of access. So the youth need to have opportunities to be able to access these knowledge networks and these competency networks. At a second level, the role of these incubators are trying to bridge the gap. Yes, it's different young people that have all of these different aspects, and also policymakers, decision makers are focusing on creating a conversation that doesn't necessarily exist in the different countries. And right now, certain countries in Northern Africa, they're engaging in consultations and public mobilizations at a local, regional, national level. But this should be focused on the sense of saying, we don't want to turn them into tokens. Yes, like, okay, I have women, I have young people just to have them. But the focus needs to really respond to the actual needs of these people. And another point that was included is the issue of climate change. The youth reflect upon this issue to a great deal because they are really looking straight into the future and looking at what will happen. So inclusion, mobility, and transformation are keywords that are very important, and they need to they need to be disseminated at all levels, at the level of the policies, at the level of the financing and of international cooperation, how to finance not just mobility programs, but also programs that focus on support and on tutorship. So those need to be combined. And also to ask real questions about the future, to ask ourselves, yes, how we see this Mare Nostrum in the future, and how we can build virtual bridges and physical bridges as well to engage in these discussions on mobility and really create this innovation, a type of innovation that would really be useful for all. For example, the COVID-19 vaccine is also an issue of transnationalism and of mobility, where many young people, especially in Africa, they find some kind of hope there because they can create value added. And another note that I would like to make regarding what can be done, there are many think tanks that are not able to speak directly to the young because they get entangled and the messages do not arrive and are not carried through. So I think that there need to be tools that are, I don't know, using TikTok or using videos that really will allow the young people to be able to relate to that more. So bring the voice of the young people to the stage. This is the approach. You have to find a new way to communicate and a new way to engage them. I am positive that this will create new ideas that in turn will be able to generate the policy making, not just in our countries, but also how we can go about these matters. Finally, we have to focus on the inclusion pathway through means of representation. This may be in the national, regional, or bilateral cooperation organizations, and to have control indicators, because without control, without accountability, this is impossible to develop. Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Adnan, and also for being succinct. I am sure that we will have the chance to go back to these discussion points. We will try to leave some time for the exchange between us and possibly with the public. And we will now give the floor to Amal El Wasif. He is another expert in the PCNS. Amal, you have the floor. Amal? Hello?
Oui.
Amal? I would like to thank you, first of all, for your introduction, and also thank the organizers of the Policy Center for the New South and the Center for Mediterranean Integration for organizing this webinar on the mobility of young people and also researchers. I am particularly interested in this topic because I'm an active member of research and I work on issues of innovation and young people, so I think this is a very important topic for me. Actually, as you said before, there was a paper published in 2018 in the framework of the Forum for the Young, organized by the PCNS and the CMI, and that is called Building a Community in the Mediterranean for Youth and for Learning and Research, and the incubators and the obstacles as well. I would like to begin by providing some context regarding the concept of mobility by putting this into the context of the partnership in the Mediterranean, and to understand how this concept of mobility has evolved over time, and also in light of the changes that we have seen in the relationship between the European Union and the partner organizations. So when we analyze the concept of mobility, we can verify the fact that ever since the first communication started in the Barcelona process, and the idea of a partnership in the Mediterranean has been perceived as a tool and also as an objective to materialize prosperity in the neighboring countries of the South and the Mediterranean space, and also an objective to be able to have the European Union to adopt a certain number of values regarding cultural change and prosperity. So this was perceived in the first communications of the European Union, and like I said before, when the Barcelona process was launched. The changes that were identified in the relationship between the north of Europe and the partner countries showed that slowly the concept of mobility began to be perceived as a way to leverage the spirit. And it was a tool that was often linked to the issue of readmission. So in many cases, it was to exercise pressure on the states to readmit those who had left the countries. And I believe that this link was established between mobility, visas, and readmission. And I think that this is a vast category. There is a large number of citizens in the southern countries were penalized because of this, and I believe that it's very difficult to say how pertinent this approach was, and it's not my role to do so. But our countries in the eastern side of the continent involved multiple interventions, and many support was received with positive results with the neighboring countries of the East. Today, we have several countries that not only focus on the facilitation of visas, but also the possibility of accessing the territories of Northern Europe without the need for a visa, especially for temporary stays. And so for countries in the neighboring countries of the South, this was a challenge. And there is an aspect as well of the link and the conditionalities between visa and readmission, which have caused mobility not to fulfill no longer to fulfill its role as a cultural driver. And there were also institutional contradictions at the European level. And I would like to mention two specific points in this regard. Firstly, the contradictions that exist, or not contradictions, but incoherences between the member states and the European Commission, because the question of mobility is a very complex and very sensitive issue in the European context. And it is actually something that is shared between the member states and often has to do with admitting people who can enter their territories, and between the European Union at a community level. This is why very often the European Commission has tried to negotiate mobility agreements, and they cannot really propose mechanisms that are interesting and that really offer interesting things for the partners, because the member states in the European Union have the last word when it comes to facilitation of visas and the access to the European Union in general. So I'm not going to repeat this. This has been clearly described by the other panelists. And I would like to just go back to the concept of relative deprivation and the countries in the southern shore of the Mediterranean who are affected by this. Decision makers in these countries are concerned about this feeling of being deprived of this liberty, and visas have been part of the negotiation. Unfortunately, I can mention the case of Morocco, where the dialogue on mobility has started in 2003, and it hasn't really made any progress and hasn't moved forward because the motivations are not really there. There is no will. The issue of visas hasn't moved forward. It's a very sensitive issue regarding readmission. So the question of mobility shows much divergence between the European Union and the partner countries, especially in the south shore of the Mediterranean. And actually, what happens with the countries of Eastern Europe in general, there are differences, demographic differences, and also political differences between South and East neighboring countries, but there is a comparison established between the two groups of countries, and there is a bit of incoherence identified and differences between the two shores. And this difference in treatment is not easy to understand for decision makers of the countries of the South and for the young as well. So now I would like to mention the fact that there are also technical obstacles, and I have mentioned this as well, and the incoherences in the decision making at the level of the European Union. I think that it cannot be denied that the European Union is a very important actor at an international level when it comes to mobility. And I think that, for example, I can mention the program Erasmus Plus. I cannot give updated numbers of this program, but this is a program that has allowed several young people to be able to travel to Europe, and young people in several countries, including the countries of the South Shore, and this has allowed them to stay and be able to study in universities in Europe. And I think this is very important because actually mobility is a way to act on certain stereotypes, certain perceived ideas that we cannot change if we do not have a direct link one with the other.
Well, this is with regard to what happens in connection with mobility. And as I was saying, there are obstacles that are institutional, of course, and political or policy-related obstacles. There are as well the technical obstacles, for example, visas, the bureaucratic, the red tape, the bureaucracy involved in getting a visa. For example, if there is for example, a researcher that needs to travel because that is part and parcel of working as a researcher, and this implies a lot of costs sometimes, and it is something that is quite significant, for a student. And there's also, we need to consider the partner countries, because there is also the issue of territorial equality. There is a search for partner research. For example, I have benefited from programs of this nature. So it is thanks to these programs that I was able to have do my scholarship program in the Collège d'Europe, for example. So I But unfortunately, there are technical obstacles that still persist in connection with visa obtention. For example, over the past few years, several countries in the EU have used intermediary agencies that manage visas and the granting of visas. And well, many of these agencies are not on the same page with regard to or vis-a-vis the consulates and other organizations. I can mention the example of mobility for academic research, for example, which I mentioned before. And there is a clear regulation in most consulate sites in the European countries that state that if someone needs to travel because of scientific research, there are visa costs that are accepted for this person, but that really doesn't happen because the agencies do not apply that, and the person finally needs to pay for the visa charges, and this procedure may take a long time, and it may also affect their mobility. As well, there's also the outreach program, that is to say, the amplitude of the various programs, sometimes they do not talk to one another. Like during most of the time, like these programs, the outreach activities are restricted to the big cities, to large capitals, and it is difficult for people living otherwise to start their journey, for example, and this is something that can be very discouraging. So this is a real life obstacle to the mobility of people, and we need to work on this as part of partnerships happening in the Mediterranean. Finally, recommendations. I started with talking about specific factors. If we come back to the visa granting problem, for example, we need to really work on this aspect because it is the main obstacle against the mobility of the younger researchers. There are several modalities in order to lighten the red tape and the bureaucracy. For example, towards the end of 2020, there was a project to reform the conditions of visa granting so that they are simplified and streamlined, and so as to privilege a more fluid kind of mobility, especially for researchers and other categories of professionals or young students, so that they may be able to travel more easily without so much hassle. And in the context of COVID and everything that happened, well, it is probably because of this that the project has not really been translated on site. And it would really be good to see things take off finally. And it is also a matter of establishing or striking a balance in such a way that European countries are able to materialize research and academic partnerships with the countries in the South, because sometimes it is a top-down approach. It is through universities or specific structures. This approach it can, of course, foster cooperation, but however, it lacks some kind of interaction between the younger generation and the researchers that are independent. They are very active in the research milieu, and they require quite a bit of support. And so it is necessary to consider the partner countries in connection with territorial equality, and it is necessary to make efforts so as to reduce the gaps in communication. And this was already mentioned by the previous speaker. That is to say, there are several programs that are available, but communication on these programs really has room for improvement. So if there are any questions, I'm available to provide answers. Thank you, Amal. You have been very clear, very synthetic as well. Adnan, would you like to add anything to the presentation delivered by Amal? Can you hear me? Yes, I think that we have a little bit of a bias here, right here, as the younger generation has been more synthetic than the older generation. That represents the current mindset, in fact, and this means what needs to be changed. I agree with what Amal has just said, because I think that in this panel there are issues that are directly related to mobility and visa, and this has to do with geopolitics, and this is what needs to be addressed from a different angle. I am an activist, and I manage the things that I can handle, but what we need to transform here is in favor of opportunities based on skills. Also, how can institutions, whether it be development or research institutions, how can they transform their way of acting or of working so as to include the younger generation? They can even have a young generation committee as part of their representation. And finally, thirdly, creating platforms for communication, so that if the young generation cannot travel, well, helping them out, creating a conversation platform, whether it can even be virtual. Since COVID, we have gotten used to working remotely. There are participants from 30, 40, 100 countries from the world communicating the one with the other from their homes. So this also creates platforms for communication and projects moving forward. So I think that what really matters is to change the story, I think that we should be solutions oriented. We should find strategic ways of responding to the needs of the younger generation, and also exercising influence. As I say, we need to have a more egalitarian and inclusive way of seeing things and working. It's not the north-south dynamics that has existed so far. And this is the way in which we will really be able to produce an impact on future generations. Thank you, Amal. Because they are asking me to stop the question and answer session. We are not going to have it. We are going to remove it. But Amal, you have a few seconds to share a number of conclusions, and then we will move on to the closing remarks. We need to make up for lost time because, we started later. So, Amal, just a few secs. I would like to insist again on visas, because I think that without a visa, you cannot exercise your mobility rights. So it's really important to have a visa, because we can do lots of things thanks to technology, but that does not make up for the need for physical contact with other cultures. And this makes contact with other cultures. It really changes the way of doing things. And I would like to add another point. People speak a lot about researchers, and but there is also another category, which is people that have a degree or a title, and they are discriminated against because they are denied opportunities for mobility. They do not have a university degree specifically, but they have another kind of degree. And these are people that can really influence society because sometimes the effort is not made to integrate them. These are young people that really need to be able to move around between countries, and the impact that they receive in their experience, in turn, they will transmit or they will convey to the societies in which they live. So this will therefore meet this objective of building prosperity in the space. So if we can convince decision makers with regards to how important granting visas is, we will be able to make a lot of progress on this topic. For quick points before closing this session. The first one is that there is a clear consensus, so we saw it today, on the fact that mobility is a fundamental element for both personal and professional training in the younger generation. This includes temporary migrations, also internships, etc. Doha mentioned in her presentation the existence of space-based barriers that superimpose impose themselves with social barriers. And it is for this reason that the mobility of the younger citizens is the very heart of the need to develop a community and a real partnership in the Mediterranean. As Adnan was saying, it is necessary. We have been talking about visa problems for the past 15 years, and in the past, we were already saying that the limitations for the rights to visas played a significant role against the materialization of effective partnerships in the Mediterranean, whether it be a politician that has decision power on the visas or through a partnership across the Mediterranean. We cannot talk about legitimacy if we do not have a mechanism that facilitates visas, at least for a certain category of persons, because the truth, and Amal's presentation showed this, is that mobility is not a natural reality in the Mediterranean. There are too many obstacles. There are too many obstacles against an egalitarian approach for the North and the South in the Mediterranean and the younger generation. And finally, the partnerships based on talent, which were launched by the European Commission as part of the new compact on migration in September 2020, offers an opportunity for linking the development of skills and mobility and migration. But this will happen only if it benefits a larger number of participants, but the systems in both countries need to be present, both in the North and the South. And as by way of conclusion, it is necessary to consider these points, and unless there are quick reactions from Adnan or from Amal, I am going to give the floor to my dear friend Larabi, and the director of the Marseille Center for CMI, and Ms. Blanca Moreno Donson, you have the floor.
Que tu as déjà fait une pré-synthèse de la richesse de l'analyse qu'on a.
Thank you very much for making a summary and for allowing us to hear these different perspectives that are so relevant for the different perspectives. We have really profited from the time allotted, and as a conclusion, I would like to just mention very briefly 2 or 3 points. I think we are part of this will to really do a crossover between the different perspectives. And the perspectives of the North and the South need to intertwine. Yes, the South needs to look at the North, and the North needs to look at the South. We have verified that beyond this perspective, we also have an interdisciplinary crossover, and actually migration is really a crossover of different disciplines of analysis. We have heard really marvelous interventions from Monsieur Fagg, and thanks to all of these practices that focus on reflection on migration has presented in a very clear and lucid way the link between the issue of demographics and the specificity of the South in the transformation and regarding the mobility. This perspective has always been like a deep dive that included also a retrospective to maybe clarify the present and the future of mobility. And Monsieur Fagg, really made a point of telling us that this has existed for a long time. It's a historical trend, and that it's very important to approach the specific characteristics of mobility during this period in the Mediterranean to really insist on certain aspects that are so important in this analysis and regarding this distinction between migration and mobility. This distinction will, of course, allow us to reposition the discussion on visas and admission from another angle. This is very important. If we focus on this perspective, it's very important to construct these aspects of mobility, and without a doubt, this must be the focus of the CMI and also for the North, with the most important aspects, and to create a new charter, maybe a new charter for free circulation in the Mediterranean. So these crossover perspectives has also been described by another colleague that mentioned the psychological and symbolic dimension. Maybe the psychological aspects are in the opinion of some, very far from reality, but Dr. Alaya showed us how it is so close, and how deconstructing the typical and stereotypical representations regarding migrants in the different situations, and how they self-perceive as deprived of certain equalities or equal access opportunities. And she described how this is much deeper than what meets the eye. And she also reflected upon the educational system in the South, where if not subject to some kind of change, they will not be able to provide this issue of mobility with positive content. And I think that in the last part of her presentation, she really made a point of discussing the fact that if we analyze in full the educational system and analyze the behaviors and the representations of migrants, maybe we can move on to a re-problematization of the issue of mobility, and to really look at it from a more positive perspective than what it is perceived elsewhere, always as a negative or destabilizing factor. In the intervention on demographics and psychological aspects, we focus on human capital as the center for the discussions on mobility. And behind the human capital, we have the issue of stability of relationships between the North and the South. When behaviors change and when representations are revisited, we avoid these negative stereotypes that were described in this presentation. This is a very interesting perspective, and it's far from the macro, and we focus on more micro aspects of mobility and this link between research and action. The youth are not in research as a form of devalorizing inclusion or a way to find well-being. We are talking about inclusion that is innovating and that is motivating, that motivates innovation. So incubation, this concept that has been going around for a few years, focuses on how to strengthen platforms to connect the young of the North and the South. We believe this is extremely useful to ensure mobility and innovation. And this is part of the actions and initiatives that need to be considered. The different interventions included our colleague Amal El-Wasif, who described issues of the South Mediterranean and mentioned the fact that Europe, whatever the circumstances may be today, Europe has in itself certain positive initiatives regarding the mobility, particularly the mobility of the youth and those young people that have concluded their university studies. And there are certain programs, including inter-university programs. But of course, she also reminded us of the fact that this mobility focuses on certain type of young people, and there is a lack of regional distribution. And we need to identify means to really reach these young people and really ensure that all possibilities reach everyone. She mentioned how it is important to defend with rigor and vigor the issue of mobility and the issue of access to visas, because at the end of the day, of course, we must not mistake, as Philippe said, this is not the same as migration. Yes, mobility is not the same as migration, and policies and guidelines need to be differentiated as well. So I think that based on this discussion, we have very important tools to continue our research, continue our reflection on this matter. And I think that together with the CMI and the PCNS and other partners as well, I think this is a very fruitful and interesting domain. And I think that together we can focus on the issue of mobility and keep it at the center and give it the central role that it has for the exchange among populations in the migratory movements in general. So I think that this is, in a way, what I can draw up as a conclusion in things that we must reflect upon regarding the platforms, the connectivity, the educational system, and its deconstruction and reform, and also the construction of these platforms for innovation, as well as the development of current programs regarding university mobility and how the different aspects are considered. I believe these are aspects that are interesting, and I try to include everything in this summary, and I look forward to continuing working with our partners. Thank you very much.
¿Qué pasa? Ah, mais il y a la remarque de Madame Blanca Moreno d'Hudson.
We have the comments of Blanca